Rhys is an incredibly humble man, but he's done, his footprint is across this faculty in so many ways in terms of how we teach Māori health, particularly but not exclusively in the medical program, in terms of how we prepare the workforce, particularly in terms of Māori members of the workforce, from clinicians through to researchers and policymakers and leaders. And in particular, leading things such as we have a Maori Health Intensive where all of our second-year clinical students come together for a week, work interdisciplinary in an interdisciplinary and interprofessional way, and learn about things like social determinants in health and the difference between engaging with someone in their lived experience so they can live the best life possible versus blaming them for their ostensive behaviors without any context on how those sorts of things develop over time. He's almost entirely disinclined to ever mention it, but also Rhys in 2020 won the Prime Minister's Supreme Award for teaching via Aku Aotearoa. So he literally was the best teacher in New Zealand for a year. I say that to make him squirm. And I like to mention that for a number of reasons. One, because the work he does is amazing, and I want to talk about that, but also because Rhys's way of teaching, his way of working with students and with colleagues is very mana enhancing. And he has a very particular ability to help people be challenged in a respectful but substantive way when they need to look at what their values and their ignorance needs to be examined and discarded and hopefully replaced with something better. So there is a presumption by a lot of people that the best teachers are the ones who like being on the center of the stage and like the attention all about them. Guilty as charged, I am one of those teachers. But actually, the best teachers are themselves. And Rhys is unapologetically and beautifully himself. So Rhys, please come up. Associate Professor Rhys Jones.
Ooh, that was quite the introduction. No reira, tēnā tātou katoa. I te tuatahi, ki a koe Robbie, tēnei te mihi nui ki a koe. Nau i whakatūwhiri i tēnei hui, tēnei ata. Nau hoki i whakawāte i tēnei wāhi mā tātou no reira. Tēnei kāmihi, kia ora. Ai, tautoko ana ngā mihi kua mihia ki a rātou kua huri ki tua o te ārai. No reira, kua mihia, kua tangihia, ki aroha atu ki a rātou. No reira, waiho rātou ki a rātou, ka hoki ki a tātou i tēnei wā. Tātou te hunga ora. No reira, nau mai, hara mai, pai ki te tūtaki i a koutou i tēnei ata. No reira, tēnā tātou katoa. Me mihi ka teke hoki ki a Ngāti Whātua, me o rātou mana i tēnei whenua, no reira, Ngāti Whātua, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou anō i tō koutou aroha manakitanga ki a mātou, ki a huitahi tēnei wāhi, tēnei wā, reira, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko wai tēnei e tuake nei, ko whakapūnake te maunga, ko wairoa te awa, ko Ngāti Kahungunu te iwi, ko Ngai te apatu te hapu, ko Tāke Timu te marae, ko Rhys Jones, tōku ingoa, no reira, tēnā tātou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today and to speak with you. I did, just in my little mihi there, just did want to acknowledge Robbie and the team from Te Ihunuko Māori o tēnei whare wānanga for opening up our session this morning, to acknowledge Ngāti Whātua and the good grace and hospitality that they're showing for allowing us to meet on this whenua and to share in the kōrero and the mahi that we're going to share throughout this hui. And also absolutely to acknowledge those who have gone in past, and not just here, but for all of us, wherever they may be, and yeah, to bring us into this space. I have to say, I was really daunted by the invitation to be part of this, because I don't consider myself to be an expert in flexible learning. And I was even more daunted when I discovered that this session was going to be an hour and a half long. And I was going, oh, goodness, what I know about this kaupapa is probably much less than I could spin out into 90 minutes. And so I was wondering if there was some expectation for I don't know, some kind of song and dance routine or something else. But since I have no other great talents to speak of, I'll try and keep to the kaupapa. And John reassured me that actually you guys are pretty good at talking and pretty good at coming up with ideas and kōrero and discussion. So hopefully you'll be able to fill in some of the many gaps that I will no doubt leave in my kōrero. And I was actually quite daunted also when I went back and looked at the topic, the title that I'd chosen for this kōrero, which seems kind of ambitious. It sounded like a good, rolled off the tongue at the time, but we'll see if we can do it justice in this little session here. Really wanting to focus on this notion of radical flexibility and ideas around relationality and justice in how we teach, but also kind of in the broader educational project that we're all part of. What I will do is I'll just give you a little bit of background about myself. I think John's already painted a little bit of a picture. But as I mentioned in my little pepeha, that I'm from Ngāti Kahungunu. My whānau's from Wairoa, various places around the sort of northern Hawke's Bay and up into the East Coast region. I grew up down in Napier, and that's where most of my whānau are now. Went to school down there, and then grew up a little bit more and ended up coming to this medical school back in the days where it was called the Auckland Medical School rather than the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences that it is now. And did my medical training, and then I'll cut a long story short, eventually ended up going into public health medicine. And so I think that this was driven by a sense of, I was doing a lot of work in pediatrics at the time, working out at Middlemore Hospital mainly, and really thinking this is certainly one way to approach the health problems that we're seeing in front of us. Lots of predominantly Māori and Pacific young children coming in to hospital sick. But it's probably not the only way. And in my idealistic sort of state at the time, decided that there had to be a better way to address some of these problems. And, I kind of could see firsthand that a lot of the health issues we were seeing were eminently preventable. And so decided to specialize in public health medicine. So I did my training in public health, very much with a focus on equity and Indigenous rights, Indigenous health, and very much influenced by the work of people like Paparangi Reid, who was kind of like our godmother, our matriarch and guru in terms of Māori public health. And starting to get an insight into kind of critical thinking, kaupapa Māori ways of viewing public health, in quite different ways to the sort of mainstream medical education that I'd had earlier. And I then went from training in public health and ended up back here at the University of Auckland somehow. I never thought when I was an 18-year-old sitting in these lecture theatres here that I would end up back here as a teacher. But here we go. That's funny how life works sometimes. And I've ended up in Te Kupenga Hauora Māori, the Māori Health Department. And as John said, a big part of my work has been trying to revitalise, upgrade, develop hauora Māori or Māori health curricula to meet the needs of the challenges we have in terms of Māori health, in terms of inequities and kind of broader issues. And I guess the other thing to say is that more recently, my work has been really partly involved in climate change and health, and thinking through planetary health and issues around relationships between environments and humans and human well-being, particularly from an Indigenous perspective, and what do Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and being have to contribute to some of the challenges we face in terms of ecological crises. And so I will kind of touch on those sorts of themes as we go through the kōrero today. And also more recently, as well as being involved in Ora Taiao, which is kind of more of a climate and health advocacy organisation, I've been trying to set up a national network really around climate change and health research, which is this emerging rōpū called Climate Health Aotearoa. And really trying to pull together some of the research and some of the thinking around climate change and health from a broad range of people within Aotearoa, but also linking into the Pacific in particular. So that's a very brief run through of, I guess, my career. In terms of what I want to talk through today, and going with the theme of flexibility, I might depart from this at times, and we might kind of go into different areas and explore things if you're interested. So please, give me a few cues as I'm going through, and if something's really boring or you want to shift tack or explore something in more detail, then please let me know. But I really wanted to give a brief sense of the context and talk about this concept of radical flexibility, because it's something that sort of resonates with the way I think about education. Alongside that, really, how do we understand and confront colonialism as it exists within education and seems to provide the foundation for a lot of what we do? I'll talk through kaupapa Māori pedagogies and some examples really of the way that we've tried to draw on kaupapa Māori principles, sort of decolonial theory, in trying to transform or at least nudge the curriculum in a certain direction and in a way that tries to challenge and disrupt some of the colonial groundings of our education system. I'll talk about this idea of pedagogies of discomfort, because one of the very challenging things I think that we come up against is this balance between trying to provide a safe and effective learning environment, but also the fact that actually we have to push people out of their comfort zone and into areas of really challenging their previous beliefs and worldviews if we are to move forward. And then at the end, I'll try and do a little bit of what does that all mean for what we do. In terms of the context, the way I think about the world today, and I think perhaps many of us do, is that there are these kind of overwhelming crises and really intersecting massive, wicked problems, huge challenges that we face. And some of those are captured on this slide here, but I think there's a lot more going on than that. Obviously, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, still seeing that persisting. But behind that, there's a whole lot of other real major challenges and crises going on. Clearly, climate change and the sort of broader ecological crises that we're facing, biodiversity collapse, etc., are huge. And, I think also looking around the world today, it's really difficult to ignore the fact that there's massive gross human rights abuses going on, genocides happening around the world, major humanitarian crises in many parts of the world. And so, this is kind of painting a fairly depressing picture, but I think to try and understand this, the way that I have come to understand, how these things are all emerging and growing and confronting us, is that, colonization really lies at the root of a lot of these crises and the way that humanity is engaging in the world. And so I quite like this quote that the ecocidal, which is around destruction of the environment and ecosystems, ecocidal logics that now govern our world are not inevitable or human nature, but are the result of a series of decisions that have their origins and reverberations in colonization. And I think, if we look at all of those crises, they kind of can be drawn back to this idea of or these sort of ideologies of colonialism and the way in which those ideologies separate people out, divide and conquer, have certain groups being valued and prioritized and others being devalued. And that relates to not just humans, but also our more than human relations and the way in which, from a colonial and particularly a capitalist perspective, that humans are seen as superior to other beings and also as superior to and sort of rightful users and rightful users of the Earth's resources. And so, in that context, what do we need from, I've got here higher education, but I think it's really education in general, is that, we actually need education that can equip us to deal with this world that we're living in. And that requires a meaningful and just response. It also requires, obviously, as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, that we've got to be really nimble and able to adapt to quite unpredictable, often rapidly shifting circumstances. And I think that's only going to become more of an issue as we move into, climate crisis and other crises. And it also requires us to recognize that those things have really seriously inequitable impacts on different groups of people and learners. And so, part of our challenge here is to think about how to, imagine, but then also create those better futures. And that requires, a bit of a shift, I think, in a lot of the ways in which, or for many of us, we're engaged in education. And it means, thinking about all these things around accessibility, equity, but also decolonization as a critical part of that. And also the kind of point about flexibility here, I think, is really critical, that we can't just do a one size fits all, and presumably I think we're all onto that kind of concept, but really need to think about how what we're doing impacts on people from very diverse backgrounds, with very diverse needs and resources and challenges. And so that brings us to this idea of a radical flexibility in education. And I guess a key point here is that this notion of radical flexibility is not just about, sometimes what people think about in terms of flexible learning, flexible education is kind of the, anytime, any place, anywhere. accessibility and being versatile for students' different needs. But it also actually means examining the very purpose and nature of learning itself. And that leads us to, as I've kind of perhaps alluded to, these quite big existential questions about humanity, about our place in the greater scheme of things, about how we relate to all other beings and non-beings, and how we relate to the whenua, the earth, the planet itself. And so, yeah, it's not just about taking what we're currently doing and working out how we can do that more equitably, but yeah, what kind of education do we actually want? And that involves asking these big questions about sort of what future do we want? So I have some thoughts about what kind of future we want, although to be fair, this is probably what kind of future do I want? So feel free to just take that with a grain of salt. But I really come back to this kind of concept from a Māori worldview that as we progress, we walk backwards into the future. And so essentially, all that we can see and understand and know is what has gone before us. And so from that sense, we're kind of looking to the past and I guess the present as we move into the future. And what's in the future from a Māori perspective, which is behind us, cannot really be known. And so I think one of the key kind of principles is, in terms of thinking about how do we address these challenges that we're facing, is to look to and learn from what has gone before. That doesn't mean returning to the past and doing everything exactly as our tupuna or ancestors did it. But what it does mean is looking to learn from perhaps those ways of doing things that we've abandoned or moved away from that are now, creating some of the crises and challenges that we're facing. And another concept that I find quite useful actually comes from some Native American peoples who use this idea of the original instructions. And this is really about understanding what that knowledge is that's been passed down through generations that enables us to live in harmony, sustainably, with everything else in this world. And those are kind of conceptualized as the original instructions, right? So these are unwritten. You probably won't find a little manual with 25 different languages telling you how to operate these things, but about how to, live equitably, sustainably, fulfill our obligations, our mutual responsibilities to everything else that we are related to. And so I guess from this kind of idea, Indigenous peoples in particular have lived according to these instructions for generations and generations and millennia. But I think it's not just Indigenous peoples that have had these things, these original instructions. And it seems to me that every population, every society in the world would have had to have kind of rules and principles for how to live and how to be a part of an ecosystem and part of a wider community that involves not just humans but all our other relations. And it also seems to me that through modernization, colonization, colonialism, the emergence of some different worldviews and different ways of imagining ourselves as humans, we've moved away from these original instructions in many societies around the world. And so again, thinking about what does the future we want look like. And again, this is maybe future I want, being selfish here. But I really look to a lot of the ideas that, that I've been working with and thinking about in planetary health and in how do we respond to the challenges posed by climate change and other ecological crises. And I think Indigenous ways of being in the world really can help to move us towards that future vision of what kind of things do we need to respond to these crises. And these Indigenous ways of knowing and being really emphasize interdependence. And so there's this idea that we are related and connected to all other things. And therefore, there's this interdependence, there's this reciprocity that goes with that connects to all our relations in the natural world. And that's part of what we need, I think, to move towards this vision. And you'll see there, this is from a particular paper around education for sustainable healthcare. But if we link it back, we go back to those natural laws, or from the previous slide, original instructions that really guide how we should live on this earth. And so to kind of put that into a bit more of a practical sense, I guess, what are some of the strategies and actions that we might need to take to, and what might this vision of a future look like? I think it is one where we've actually restored connections with nature, where we've, in the modern world, we've gradually moving away and disrupting those connections and living this life of sort of being almost isolated from nature, unless you make deliberate and explicit, moves to try and engage. But also with Indigenous communities who, despite the impacts of colonization, despite many other things, have maintained a sense of that connection and have maintained, to a greater or lesser extent, the knowledge, but also the practical and tangible connections that enable us to kind of maintain those relationships with all of our relations. There are things like, explicitly recognizing the rights of nature that we're starting to do. We've seen a few examples of that with, for example, like the Whanganui River, Te Urewera National Park, where we're starting to see this concept of actually it's not just humans that have rights, but we need to extend that to many other parts of the world. Yeah. Part of this vision also involves dismantling some of the systems that perpetrate colonial, patriarchal violence. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Also I think one of the key things for us in education to think about is actually how do we critique, challenge some of the, I guess, the accepted norms that we have around dominant knowledge systems, so that we can create space for mātauranga Māori, for Indigenous knowledges, but also a variety of other types of knowledge that are marginalized or perhaps even invisible within typical mainstream education. And I think this vision also includes moves to recognize Indigenous sovereignty, land back, protection, revitalization of Indigenous languages, and a shift in the way we're living, actually, from this very individualized, sort of privatized sense to more communal, intergenerational ways of living. Another part of the vision I have, at least for the future, is one where, as I say, Indigenous sovereignty is recognised. And some of you may be aware of work that's been done around constitutional transformation and this constitutional conversation that some in the Māori world particularly have been having, which has resulted in a report of the Mātiki Mai Aotearoa working group. And what this really sort of paints some possible future scenarios of different spheres of authority working so that we can have a government operating under kāwanatanga, but we also have a sphere of authority that relates to tino rangatiratanga, so that there is not just Indigenous participation in how we operate as a nation, as a society, not just Indigenous, partnerships with Māori, but actually a sense of self-determination of tino rangatiratanga. And so, some of the ideas I've put forward around the type of future we want, I think can't really be achieved if we have the kind of political system and governance arrangements that we currently have. So we need to think about, actually, this is part of moving towards that future. And so if that's the kind of future we want, what kind of education do we need? I've got some general ideas here, and I'll try and explore this more and give some examples as I talk more about how we've put some of this into practice, perhaps in Māori health teaching and learning and curriculum. But I think one of the key things is that we need to kind of move from a system which, in my view at least, we see learners as discrete individual beings who we need to fill with knowledge, or at least, change in some way so that they then become able to perform at some certain level or develop the knowledge, skills, attitudes that we want. Whereas I think we need to shift to a different way of viewing things, where actually it's grounded in this principle of everything being related to everything else, and understanding the mutual responsibilities that emerge from that it's not just about us or learners as individuals, but about how they're part of bigger communities, how they relate to each other, and the responsibilities that entails. And so, this idea of radically flexible education begins with that recognition that we're holistic beings, right? And our learners are not just here to gain knowledge for that sake, but actually are embedded in communities. They have this kind of very complex and unique web of obligations and responsibilities and sort of reciprocal obligations and responsibilities with other people, but also with other, with their land, their broader community as well. And so this idea of responsibility is a critical concept, and it's one that I'll try to come back to, but essentially it's not about I guess from a typical sort of neoliberal education perspective, sometimes the responsibility is about, what's my responsibility as a learner to the institution, to, hand my assignments in on time, to engage, as you're expected to as a student, those sorts of things. It's about a much more holistic sense of responsibility that, collectively, what is our responsibility to respond to these crises that we're seeing, to respond, to try and change the trajectory that we're on towards, a more relational, human way of being in the world. And so this sense of responsibility then that we're talking about is really about that relationality, right? So it's about how can we as learners and as educators fulfill those responsibilities that we have within the broad web of relationships that we're part of. Okay, is that making sense so far? Okay, ka pai. And so for me, one of the things that this makes me think about is confronting colonialism in education, and really trying to make visible some of the invisible ways often that colonialism sort of pervades the system that we're working in, the ways in which we're expected to work, the ways in which our students are expected to learn, etc. And I'm going to draw on actually a bit of work that I was involved in, not just this, but this is part of a sort of bigger journey that we've been on within Indigenous health teaching and learning and curriculum development. But I was fortunate enough to be a part of a international project where we worked with collaborators from partners from Canada, Turtle Island, from Hawaii, here in Aotearoa, but also in Australia. And looking at Indigenous health education and what that meant and how we could develop within, what's often a fairly colonial institutional environment, move towards some of the things that I've been talking about. And one of the key things that came up, as we're talking and as we're engaging in thinking and researching, is that our experiences as Indigenous health educators, as academics within health professional education systems, trying to develop and push for Indigenous health curricula and things, our experiences were hugely similar, and so much of what we were experiencing just resonated across, no matter if we were in Canada, Australia, here, very similar kinds of things, and really led us to kind of try and understand how colonialism was driving a lot of those dynamics. And yeah, I think it's really important to think through that this is just an example from medical education and the ways in which colonial ideologies, worldviews, values, some of these things which certainly to me, when I was going through my undergraduate medical education and then training, these things were not visible or not really acknowledged, but kind of it's only later once you start reflecting on that kind of education that say, well, that's not the norm, the only way of thinking about health and medical education. But we see things like anthropocentrism, so very much a human-centric focus that, the primary goal is advancement of human well-being, and almost a denial of the fact that our well-being is very much connected to the well-being of our environments and other things around us. This idea of biological determinism, scientific racism came through very strongly, that that a lot of the, for example, ethnic inequalities in health were explained by genetic differences or, biological things that determine those health outcomes. And that was very much kind of typical of a biomedical emphasis around all aspects of health, rather than thinking about, well, what about all the other social, cultural, environmental determinants that could be driving our health? Very much that clinical biomedical focus, and that kind of related to very much a reductionist approach to education, that that the way we were taught was about breaking things down into smaller and smaller kind of units so that we understand how things happen at a molecular or cellular level, but we often don't really have a good sense of how everything connects to everything else within that knowledge system. And so, yeah, really lack that relational orientation. One of the things that comes through strongly in medical education is this valuing of independence, and the idea that the goal is for us to be independent individuals, and that's a healthy state of being, rather than what for many cultures is the goal, which is interdependence, to be part of a healthy community. And very much kind of implicit within a lot of medical education are these neoliberal capitalist ideals, really, around who is valued, who's not valued, who's deserving, not deserving. And we see that coming through with all the isms and the norms around who we should be privileging within society, and what types of people and qualities we should be driving for. And you can kind of see that education within that context, if we're thinking about how can we address Indigenous health inequities, that kind of education is just going to uphold the same dynamics around power, privilege, oppression that actually created the problem in the first place. And so, yeah, part of our challenge really is to think about how can we move out of that consciousness and into a different level of consciousness. And so I wanted to talk through kaupapa Māori pedagogies, and maybe just give some examples of some of the ways in which we've been trying to teach that perhaps disrupts some of the standard assumptions, ways of thinking about health, patterns of health, those kinds of issues. And just to put it in context, really, the work that we've been doing around kaupapa Māori curriculum development and teaching and learning is part of a wider struggle for decolonisation, Indigenous rights, social justice, not just happening within the academy or within educational systems, but very much across broader society as well. And one of the key sort of principles, I think, is that we're looking for transformation, not just development of our learners, but also for them and for all of us to be able to contribute to transformation within institutions and the systems and structures that we work in. Okay. And so I think the reason I've got a picture of Homer Simpson here is is I want us to think about kind of, because I often think that some of the ways that I've been working have been not using my powers for good, and perhaps using some of my powers for evil. And so, yeah, Homer's often faced with this kind of dilemma, and he usually chooses the path of evil. But I'm trying to think about how can we use our powers for good, and to try and transform educational practices so that we can get our learners to start being critically aware of some of those things that I talked about, some of those ways in which colonialism is impacting on our education and practice that, certainly for me, going through my undergraduate education, I was never really aware of, at least not sort of consciously. So how can we use the skills, knowledge, and things that we have to try and transform the way that our learners are engaging? And we've sort of had this idea of the learners being or becoming agents of change, and that really relates to this idea that it's not enough for just learners to develop personally and professionally, but it's about changing systems. And that goes back to this idea of responsibility that I talked about. As learners are engaged in communities and are sort of these relational beings, what responsibilities do they have, and how can they actually use what we can support them to develop to affect change? And, I think that requires learners to be critically aware of some of the structural factors, the determinants that I've been talking about, but also to have an intolerance of the status quo, and actually be committed to making change. And so what we talk about a lot is developing this critical consciousness among learners, which, for many of us was a bit of a shift from the way we learned, particularly in a very rigid medical education system, that it's about actually not mastering a body of knowledge or developing a certain set of skills, but it's about a way of being in the world. That's about having that critical understanding of our place, our biases, our assumptions, but also locating that within a bigger picture of social dynamics, understanding colonialism, other forms of oppression, how they all relate and how we fit into that. So, we've been working around, how do we do this medical education to improve Māori health? And it's been a long journey with many different people along the way. One of the things that we did, am I allowed to move that up? One of the things we did very early on actually was to say, what are the kind of attributes that we want learners to have in terms of hauora Māori or Māori health? And hopefully you'll see there, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it's really about this sort of foundational understanding of the determinants of health, that real critical awareness about the factors that are driving health inequities and the patterns that we see. It's about being able to engage, and this is this relational idea as well, that if we want to improve Māori health, we actually have to be able to relate and engage. It's about reducing and eliminating inequities, and including, I've got on there a point about, anti-racism. And it's also about being a self-reflective learner. I think hopefully we're kind of all on board with that kind of concept as part of, a lifelong learning process. I want to talk about one of the things that we did, and I and our team here can't take any credit for this because this was something that we inherited or adopted from our colleagues down in University of Otago. But one of the things that we've put in place in the medical program is a thing called hui process teaching, which is, so this is about how medical students, and in fact other health professional students, learn about clinical consultations and about what we learned about in medical school as taking a history. So actually learning from a patient what their story is and what they're here for. And, for many years, this has been taught in medical and other health professional programs in I think, a fairly structured and quite rigid way that, there are certain things that we need to know. And certainly when I learned about how to engage with a patient and how to do a clinical consultation, it was very structured around, certain areas that you had to ask about, and not a lot of leeway around that. And what we didn't kind of understand was that underlying that, there's certain norms about, what are the important things that we need to know from a patient? What are the key aspects of health that we're interested in? And, you can probably guess that was all very biomedically, physical health focused. Whereas what we've done is, with this hui process, we've introduced a sort of an alternative way of engaging with patients. And it's really been taught as a way of engaging with Māori patients, but when our colleagues down in Otago have used this, they say actually non-Māori patients want it as well. It's not something that's kind of specific to a Māori cultural context, but it does come from Māori cultural values and ideas. And so it goes through, and you'll see here a really strong focus on relationality. So mihi, actually, who am I as a health professional or a health professional student? Acknowledging who I am, how I'm connected, my role and responsibilities here. Whakawhanaungatanga is about making connections with the patient, with their whānau, and kind of, I guess, a bit more generally as well. When I went through med school, we were taught about establishing rapport, which is very different than making connections, right? And so, part of our clinical training, we might, I don't know, talk about the weather or something else that might help, just break the ice a little bit with someone. Whereas whakawhanaungatanga is really talking about those personal connections, trying to share a little bit about ourselves, elicit some kind of reciprocal sharing from the patient, from their whānau, and then using that as a way of making actual genuine connections rather than just kind of small talk. So you can kind of see there's some very different sort of priorities going on here. The third step here, kaupapa, that's where we get to, I guess, the usual things that you would learn from a Western clinical perspective around, asking about their medical problem, past history, family history, medications, all those sorts of things. That's embedded within there. And then we have a poro or sometimes called a whakawātea, which is about how do you close and wrap up. And it's about a whole lot of things, but, checking, understanding, knowing what the future plans are, establishing what the future relationship is that you're going to have with this person or family. And, very much more kind of about that relationality than in a Western sense where it's about kind of, what's the next steps, move on. And so kind of in doing this, what we've tried to do is, I guess, give the students a different way of engaging. It was set up as a way of getting them to kind of be able to engage better with Māori patients and whānau. But actually what it's done is that we're starting to see a little bit of a shift in the institution and the curriculum as well, as as it's recognised that actually this process and the thinking behind it has a lot of value for not just Māori patients, but actually should it influence the way we teach this in general to all students and how they engage in clinical consultations. And so I kind of think about it as a little small example of decolonizing education and the curriculum, in that it's kind of made us think critically about the basis for the existing practice. What are the norms and values that are behind the current way of teaching, or the sort of conventional way of teaching, and actually calls those into question and says, well, maybe some of those things are important, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that we're missing here that's important for good clinical practice and good healthcare. So, what started out as just maybe a little bit of an add-on for students to help support them with working with Māori patients has led to a little bit more of a deeper thinking about what's the purpose of this whole thing and how can we transform to be more, to drive more towards the values that I've been talking about. All good so far? Do we want to go somewhere different, or is this it? Okay? One of the one of the real strong emphases for our Māori health teaching has been about not just accepting surface kind of explanations. And, you know, certainly when I was coming through my training, it was very much, we talked about the cause of health problems and also health inequities as very much things around people's behaviors and lifestyles, etc. So often the explanation for, you know, Māori having poorer health was because, we smoke more, drink more, eat the wrong kinds of foods, don't exercise enough, you know, all those standard things. And what we really encourage students to do is move beyond just those surface causes and kind of go back towards the left-hand side of this diagram, which takes us back to the basic causes and understand how, you know, those big systems, those racism, other forms of oppression, the, you know, really high level societal processes are actually driving some of these things through various pathways, and how that actually all links back to colonialism, colonization has actually set up the structures and the, you know, social patterns and dynamics that sort of perpetuate all these processes. Yeah, and so so it's quite interesting now when we ask students about, you know, explanations for different health issues or different patterns of health, rather than focusing on the immediate behaviors, it's always, it's colonization. It's kind of like the answer to everything, but in a way it sort of is. But we then need to think through, well, how does that play out, and how can we disrupt some of those processes? So just one example of this that I quite like is, you know, the way our health promotion and things like public campaigns around health is done is very much often at that surface level. And so this advertisement here, my brother almost died, it started with a sore throat. Well, did it really start with a sore throat? Or perhaps it started with actually, you know, things that are way back in the pathway from there. That you know, what the initial poster doesn't ask is, why did that person get a sore throat in the first place, and why did that sore throat then lead to rheumatic fever that then led to, you know, life-threatening heart damage? And yeah, and the fact that, you know, for non-Māori, non-Pacific people in Aotearoa, rheumatic fever is almost unheard of. And yet none of that is really evident there. It's all about, well, this person had a sore throat and didn't get treated. So, you know, that's the issue. So yeah, we're trying to just develop much more of that kind of critical sense of the determinants of health more broadly. And really strongly in there is understanding and tackling racism. And so one of the ways that I try to approach this, and I think this is what John was talking about around mana enhancing education and teaching and learning, is to try and really depersonalize the kind of things that we're talking about. And so, yeah, when we start talking about racism and particularly white privilege, it starts to get a little bit sensitive for many students. And I think that's because a lot of the ways in which students think about racism is often at that individual level, that, you know, there are racist people and there are non-racist people, and our aim is to not be racist. But what that misses is this whole system that we're embedded in, and that trying to understand racism as a system that affects all of us can help students to kind of engage with it in a way that doesn't feel like it's personally blaming them. And I always, when I'm talking about these kind of things, always use, I should say, I always try to use we rather than you when I'm talking about, you know, how people need to respond to racism. Because just as it is a system that affects all of us, we all have a role to play, right? And so, yeah, when I'm talking about these things about bias, about trying to address racism, I always include myself and other colleagues in that we're not just trying to blame a certain group or get a certain group of people to change. It's about a collective effort. And yeah, and very much pushing this kind of idea that again, it goes back to that agent of change thing. So it's not enough to just be non-racist. Because of the society that we live in, we actually have to try and change the systems and structures as well. So that requires us to be anti-racist. And that's very much what we're trying to push towards with our Māori health teaching and learning, our curricula. And it goes along with this idea that students are holistic beings, have responsibilities. And one thing that I'll get on and talk about is that those responsibilities are different, so that in a racist society, our responsibilities do depend on whether we are part of the racialized group that's subject to racism or not. And so, yeah, I'll talk more about some of those things as we go through. Another thing that we really try to emphasize is that while health professionals are part of, do have biases and do contribute to health inequities, that really it is about system bias, and that we are part of that system, and so we have a responsibility to change it. And one of the sort of principles also that we work with within our education is this move from cultural competence to safety. And so rather than trying to get students to understand, know about Māori culture, we're very much trying to turn the lens on examining ourselves and about, this idea of cultural safety being empowering patients to, and whānau to decide whether we are safe health professionals. Yeah, so what we're really trying to do, if we kind of boil it down, is, and I think this relates to education more broadly, often what our students want to know is, what are the 5 key points I need to know, whatever the topic is. Whereas, we actually want them to be engaging with this at a much deeper level and understanding some of these very complicated situations. I want to move on. I just want to give an example of a work in progress, I guess, that's happening at the moment. So one of my jobs at the moment is as our faculty lead for the Waipapa Taumataro course. So this is a new course that the University of Auckland is introducing. And it's going to be compulsory. I should say, I don't think they like the word compulsory, do they? It's going to be required for all first-year undergraduate students. And the idea is that it has Māori-focused content, and each faculty within the university is developing its own version of the course with some central kind of core content. And it's required us to think a lot about the kinds of issues I've been talking about, and, partly these ideas around radical flexibility. Yeah, so as I said, from next year, this course will be required for all new first-year students. It's very much focused around students developing critical thinking and these ideas of place, power, and positionality. Some of the core subject areas within the course are knowledge of place, knowledge systems, and te tiriti o Waitangi. And getting students to understand what the significance of those things is for their future learning, and practice. One of the important sort of objectives of this course, as I see it, is I see it as a way of trying to get students to be good citizens of the university, but also of society more generally. And that really involves, having a critical awareness of their roles and responsibilities. Again, coming back to this idea of responsibilities, not just in, in the wide world when they get out into employment and practice, but actually their responsibilities as learners within the education system. And so the course has a really strong emphasis on relational learning. Again, trying to move away from this idea of developing individual knowledge and skills. And so really a lot of attention to strategies for effective and safe participation in that environment. And so what does that look like in our Waipapa Taumataro course? And again, bearing in mind that it is a work in progress, so we're developing some of these things as we go. But I think what it means for me in relation to the kaupapa that we're talking about today is, again, recognizing students as relational beings embedded in communities, not just these kind of hollow vessels that we have to fill up and send on their way. And very much about acknowledgement of different relationships to place, te tiriti, and knowledge systems, those kind of core components of the course. So understanding, that someone who is tangata whenua, someone who is actually, Ngāti Whātua, will have a very different relationship to this place than, maybe an international student or someone who's not from here. Will also have a very different relationship to te tiriti than, say, tangata tiriti will, and knowledge systems. And so one of the things that we're thinking about, and bearing in mind that these are kind of mostly 18-year-old-ish students, is about what that means in terms of differentiated responsibilities. Yeah, so how do those different relationships lead us to have differentiated responsibilities? And that's led to us thinking about a number of different pedagogical approaches. One of the things that we've developed for this course, we have this kind of working document, which is about anti-racist teaching. It's kind of like a decision matrix. We flag issues within there. We work out, what impacts there may be, and what strategies we're going to use to try and address those things. So yeah, some of those things are around the curriculum, the assessment, but also just around how we create safe spaces for students and safe learning environments. One of the things that we're going to have in the course is dedicated streams for Māori and Pacifica students. And again, recognizing that we do have a lot of experience of racism from Māori and Pacifica students, but also other racialized students. And we wanted to create spaces where we can engage with the kind of issues that we're going to be talking about in ways that are safe, actually, for both non-Māori, non-Pacific students, and for Māori and for Pacifica students. One of the things that we're thinking about but haven't really fully got to grips with is, could that also mean a differentiated curriculum so that, actually when we're talking about some of these issues, Māori and perhaps Pacific students have a different, kind of like a totally different lens on it, and a different set of learning needs, different set of expectations around how they engage with things like place, with te tiriti, etc. Yeah, so again, as I say, we haven't really thought through the implications of that, but it's something that we certainly want to think about. And also developing flexible learning and assessment methods. I'll just move on to some, I guess, more specific strategies. one of the things that we're doing within this course is actually for the first few weeks, we're saying we don't really care about the content. What we really want to focus on, because we're going to have basically the in-person learning is classes of up to 30 students working mostly with interactive kind of exercises in smaller groups. And so we want to spend a lot of time and effort up front to, develop whakawhanaungatanga, to develop those relationships, those connections. Yes, we will have, conduct agreements, kind of those more formal things, but really it's about more informally developing those connections and the trust that goes with that among learners and educators as well. Got a really strong emphasis on power and privilege and positionality. So part of that first part of the course will also be getting students to understand their own positionality, in relation to this place, in relation to the learning that they're engaged in, axes of privilege and, how they sit within social hierarchies, perhaps, what that means for power dynamics within the classroom, within working with their peers, all those sorts of things. Again, as much as we can do with a group of mostly 18-year-olds. But yeah, and I think one of the other things that we're very, very mindful of is developing flexibility within the assessments so that students can relate some of these things to their own unique context, to their own, the unique set of relationships and responsibilities that they're engaged in. I might actually pause there and just, I do have a little bit more that I was going to talk about, but I just wanted to see if there was any questions or discussion about this particular kaupapa, about this particular course, what we're doing, or anything more generally that comes up for you at this point.
Let me get your microphone. That is a microphone, believe it or not.
As a cheeky question, really, I just wondered if we were able to have a look at your decision-making matrix for racism.
I would need to consult with the rest of the working group, but I think, yeah, it is something that we certainly could share. At this point, it's in a bit of a rough state and there's, random comments all over the place. It is a kind of working document, but
sounds like it'd be a really useful resource in our context.
Yeah. No, but that's something we'll certainly look at and how we could share that in a way that's useful.
Kia ora. What are some of the flexible assessments that you're planning on using? What types of assessments are they?
Yeah, that's a good question. Basically, a couple of the assessments are reflective writing assignments, and yeah, we very much want to. We're trying to frame those so that students are able to put themselves in the picture and to, like I've talked about, try and think about the kinds of concepts that we're teaching about and how they relate to, their own responsibilities, for example, within the classroom, but also more broadly. So that's one thing with the reflections. The other, again, it's a little bit of a work in progress, but one of the major assessments that we're looking at developing or including is it's called a student guide. And so the idea is that students will write something. Doesn't actually have to be written, it could be in other formats as well, which is a guide for future students coming into the faculty. And so this is kind of getting at this idea that, part of the course is about how do we be a good citizen of this university. And the flexible element of that comes in, I think, where students can actually identify what are the things that are critical for them as part of their identity, their sort of positionality within the university and within broader society. and focus on those. And so, yeah, again, not just about, the kind of general stuff that you need to do to know as a student of the university, but yeah, for a person from a particular community or with particular relationships and responsibilities, what does that mean for them? So yeah, there will be an aspect of that that's kind of got flexibility built into it. I think those are probably the main examples at this point.
Okay, Dr. Jones, I assume this Vaipapa law course is for both international and domestic students. Is that right?
Sorry, international and domestic?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So for international students, I assume they will require more background information. Are you going to, how would you be able to do that?
Yes, that is, it is one of the challenging things about this course is that we will have students from actually a range of different backgrounds. And so I think even some of the New Zealand educated students will probably also find aspects of the course quite challenging and may not have background. But yes, I think it will be a particular issue for international students. One of the things that will be doing is that it is essentially a sort of a flipped course so that all the content will be online, and we will have kind of additional or more background readings and resources for students, because we're very aware that, for example, with Te Tiriti o Waitangi, some of our students will actually be all over that. They will have learnt about it all through school and hopefully will have a pretty good understanding. Others may have virtually no understanding. And so we'll have a sort of flexible approach so that there will be additional resources and things for students. And yeah, it's something that we'll need to think about and I guess monitor once we run the course for the first time. Also, to what extent we need to kind of build in additional or different approaches throughout the course to try and establish if students aren't understanding or don't have the necessary background, how we can address that. Yeah.
So quite often the purpose of learning is very much influenced by the environment. What are you doing to make sure the environment is suitable for the purpose of the learning is?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I think there's a certain amount of the environment that we don't have a lot of control over as, just ordinary academics. But I think one of the things that we will be trying to do is, I think, as I mentioned, that this very much upfront focusing on relationships and things, I think that's a big part of trying to create an environment that is, conducive to this kind of relational learning. One of the things that we'll be focusing on quite a bit too is actually training, induction, working with supporting teachers, because we will be having teachers from possibly across the faculty who may not be actually expert in the particular areas, but we want to actually train people up and also provide them with ongoing support to be able to create that environment. It will be challenging, I think, and one of the things that we kind of also mindful of is having the dedicated Māori and Pacifica streams. We want to make sure that we're creating the right sort of environments within those spaces, which might be a little bit different from the general streams. Yeah.
Kia ora, Rhys. Just interested in the shift to the hui method and what sort of acceptance that's received across the teaching staff. Some who might have preferred the traditional method.
Yeah, I think generally it's been pretty well accepted amongst those who know about it and understand it, I think. So I think often the way it's worked is that because we've kind of been teaching students as the first port of call, the way often our staff and clinical teachers and things become aware of it is when their students start using it when they're, when they're doing a clinical examination or, talking to their clinical supervisors. And so, in general, I think there has been a little bit of pushback. I think, well, why do we need to change from the standard approach that's worked well for the last 200 years or whatever it is? So yeah, but I think once people start to understand and actually perhaps see it being used or hear from students who are using it, there has been pretty good acceptance. And one of the things that it's started to do is just influence the way the communication skills teaching is being done, and we're getting a little bit of interest in trying to actually develop a more integrated approach so that we're not just teaching, the kind of conventional, how do we do these, clinical history taking and then doing the hui process on the side, but it's actually part of a whole integrated process. And that's where I think where we're aiming, and where there does seem to be a lot of support for doing that.
My question's about the pedagogical approaches, the differentiated curricula. My understanding is strategies that do work for Māori and Pacifica are also beneficial for Pākehā or international, any kind of student. What is the kind of, I guess, trying to understand the reasoning for differentiated curricula?
Yeah, that is a very good question. The way we're thinking about it is that actually students will have different needs and different, I guess, expectations on them. So for Māori students learning about, I guess one example would be around knowledge systems and understanding of different knowledge systems and how power operates to legitimize certain knowledges and devalue others. And I think that's a core part of the learning for many students. One thing we will be talking about is Indigenous knowledge systems and mātauranga Māori, for example. And there are likely to be differences in the way that we want to do that for, say, Māori students versus non-Māori, and perhaps Pacifica students and others, in that for non-Māori students, we don't want them to be experts in mātauranga Māori necessarily. We want them to understand perhaps some of the contributions it can make, perhaps some of the sort of general principles and bases that it's working from. Whereas, for Māori students, it's obviously something that, they can engage with in a very different way. I think also in relation to te tiriti, there are different kind of expectations for tangata whenua, tangata tiriti. Certainly we want, kind of at this level, probably all students to have a basic understanding of what the treaty means, what the implications of te tiriti are moving forward. But we also, I think, want Māori students, tangata whenua, to be engaging at it from a different angle, and also tangata tiriti coming at it from a different angle. And I think that's why, in the past, there has been a lot of, with te tiriti education in general, there has been this approach of separating out tangata whenua, tangata tiriti, because it's recognised that they've kind of got different processes to work through, different histories to work through, but also thinking about what that means for each of them is quite different. Does that answer your question? Oh, got another one. Good.
Kia ora. I'm just curious to know, Rhys, whether you've had any involvement in decolonising the nursing curricula or other health professional areas bringing these ideas to bear.
Somewhat, I think, would be the answer. We have, I guess, work predominantly with the medical program, but also have, I guess, used some of the thinking and resources and curriculum to move into other programs as well. And certainly pharmacy, nursing, we have done. One of the things that we do in all the clinical programs here is have the students go through what's called Māori Health Intensive. So that is something that's an interprofessional learning experience that students have across all the different clinical programs. And so within that, they all get kind of the foundational learning around Māori health, around colonisation, health inequities, and yeah, so it's about, I think, trying to work out what fits within various different teaching contexts. And nursing is interesting in that, it's coming from, I guess, quite a long history of cultural safety as being, a critical part of nursing education. And so, yeah, we're trying to kind of link into that, but build on that with particular content around hauora Māori and health equity. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever. Thank you
Yeah.
very much for your very interesting, and I'm reflecting a lot about what you are sharing with us today. My background is in design, so my area is design, and I work in design as it relates to education. I wanted to share two things, just one briefly. The field of design worldwide has a very strong connection now to developing ways to teach design to address decolonization and racism and justice. So many of the concepts that you were sharing here today, we are actually, there are different programs around the world developing a design curriculum that kind of includes some of the concepts that you are sharing with us today. The conversation has had here in New Zealand also, there are designers from Maori background doing design and applying the Maori concepts into design as well. I am part of the Design Research Society, and we are struggling with this idea as to how we develop a design curriculum that is all encompassing and embracing of Indigenous design students, but also everyone else. So it's a conversation that is happening in the design field, and I will be happy to share names of people who are actually working on that if you will be interested to share knowledge with other groups and other disciplines that are aiming for that. So that's one thing I wanted to share. The other thing, question I had is really, when we are in these transformational processes, learning to teach and work and play in a different way, I always think about us, the teachers, the people who are doing the education. So we focus a lot in our writing on the learners, and we develop the curriculum and we develop all for the learner. But what I am noticing is that really the person who has to go through this process first is I. And then slowly, because students really look at you as a role model. That's what I have learned in all the years I've been teaching, is that my students will look me up, see what I have done, come to submission to class, and then it's like, and I felt like I had a responsibility to live the curriculum every day in my practice. So I was just wanted to share this with you to see, because this is a big transformation project that is probably going to take many years. So I was wondering about the staff.
Yeah, that is
Thank you.
that's a very good point, actually, about the role of the staff, the teachers, and it's something that we've been perhaps a little bit negative about in the university's approach to this Waipapa Taumataro course. I guess critical of the fact that it's being rolled out to students without any kind of equivalent process or education for staff. And so I think it is going to be interesting once we get cohorts of students coming through having done Waipapa Taumataro course, who then go into sometimes a teaching and learning context which is quite different from the kinds of principles that we're teaching here, and maybe more the traditional university environment. And so I think that's going to cause some problems with conflicting ways of engaging with students and students' expectations of a particular culture and way of doing things that then turns out to be quite different in some courses or some parts of the university. So yeah, I think that is going to be a big challenge, and I think we would have preferred much more to have a staff onboarding kind of process, a more general process to embed some of these things within our staff, within our institutions, before we then inflict it on students. And just going back to your other point, I think this idea of around design, like I'd be very interested to follow up on that. But I think this idea of having a kind of a general curriculum, but also something which is more specifically focused around Indigenous design, in your case, it is something that we think about a lot from the perspective of particularly Indigenous students. One of the things that we're probably guilty of, I think, is actually focusing a lot of our attention on the non-Indigenous learners. And because we look at, Māori health inequities, things like colonisation, racism, driving a lot of those problems, the focus tends to be on actually the, not necessarily the Māori students in the room. And we kind of often end up teaching to what my colleague Paparangi Reid would call the lowest common denominator. But I think what we need to think about much more is, how do we engage well and effectively with Indigenous learners as well, and hopefully that will also drive improvements in the curriculum for the rest of the students as well. Oh, one over here.
Kia ora, Rhys. Thank you for your very important mahi in this space. Just adding to the conversation really, rather than a question. When I first came into tertiary education, I was working in foundation education. So we were working to bridge the knowledge gaps, specifically for people who had been disadvantaged through the colonised education system. But of course, am I not? But we are, of course, working within a system of power and privilege and positionality to do that. So it's kind of like a double thing that you're trying to right the situation that has been so devastating for those cultures within that very system itself. And what we did to try and, I guess, strengthen this bridge was we used a porphyry model, so that we imagined ourselves as the tangata whenua and as the marae, welcoming our learners, the manuhiri, onto the marae. So we took every stage of the porphyry process and used that as a metaphor for how we worked with those learners coming into the institution and working through each of those stages to try and get through to the other end of coming out of the system with a qualification. And although we didn't manage to get that acknowledgement of that metaphor beyond the small group of learners that we were working with, It was a very empowering process for the staff who were working with those learners. And in a way, although the learners didn't necessarily even know that that was happening in the background, we did feel that we got a lot more empowerment through those cohorts that came through that model. So just another way of expressing those metaphors, really.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things I mentioned, you know, this first part of the course being quite critical. I think we will be paying a lot of attention to these sort of rituals of encounter and how we kind of move through a process of, you know, becoming whanaunga and becoming, you know, connected as educators and learners. But yeah, no, that sounds great.
Hi there. So I guess I get the last question. I get to talk into a pillow. This is interesting. I actually built quite well on what you were just talking about. If we cast our mind all the way back to some of those posters you showed us at the beginning, right? And some of the stuff that you were talking about in terms of that embedded colonialization, right? Back at CQU where I'm from, we do social innovation, and we would describe that as a wicked problem, right? A very difficult problem to solve, very embedded. And I think what you're doing individually with the students in class is really interesting. If I could ask you to crystal ball gaze for a second, I mean, we're training these students to be more conscious of culture and some of those things. Will that then eventually maybe solve that wicked problem, or how do you see that connecting back to that bigger wicked problem that you identified at the beginning?
Easy, right? Yeah.
That's just an easy one for you there. Yeah,
that is an easy one. Yeah, no, I think that's a big challenge, and I think it also relates to this question of you know, are we teaching students without actually addressing the needs of the staff, the teachers, and the institution, I guess, and trying to change some of those things. Probably the way I see it happening without actually having a crystal ball is, you know, just some of those small incremental changes that I think can then have ripple effects. And maybe that hui process example that I gave is one just little example of that, you know, by introducing some of these perhaps different ways of teaching, we can disrupt some of the kind of common assumptions and just standard practices, and get us to question, well, why are we doing those things, and are they actually achieving what, you know, the type of education we want? And I think, you know, gradually start reforming things like that. But I don't have any kind of great other vision as to how we can make that happen. But I think certainly involving the staff and the kind of working towards institutional change as part of that, I think is key. You know, I don't think it can be just the type of approach that we're doing here, which is just focused on learners, really. Yeah. Just so you can finish. Yeah, I did have a whole lot of other stuff, so I'm glad you interrupted me and asked lots of questions, because that's probably much more useful than what I would have had. But maybe just a couple of quick points to wrap up. I'm going to skim through. You'll see a lot of terrible slides here. But one thing I wanted to just very briefly mention around radical flexibility is this idea of trust, which I don't think we've engaged with nearly enough. But it is about kind of how do we move from this situation that we're currently in, where we kind of have this suspicion of learners that, which maybe is well-founded in many cases, particularly with the, you know, advent of AI, and it seems like we're constantly in this sort of arms race of trying to develop more sophisticated ways of picking up students cheating and that sort of thing, and then them developing ways of getting around those strategies. So what this radical flexibility asks us to do is think, how do we actually, rather than this sort of adversarial approach, try to establish a level of trust and, perhaps do away with some of the very punitive sort of ways that we have of working with students often. That's very challenging for those of us who are involved in like medical education and health professional education, where there's, accreditation bodies and those sorts of things. And we have to be very careful and dot the I's and cross the T's, but something to put out there, I think, just as a, how do we even engage with that? So yeah, I think basically I've covered all I wanted to say, but really just to think about learners as relational beings, as having those responsibilities within the institution, but also much more broadly beyond that. And how do we actually think about that and work with learners in that respect? Like I said, I think it's a challenging thing, and that final point there does require us to think much more broadly about decolonizing our curricular institutions and then the big wide world. So yeah, thank you very much for your questions and contributions, and yeah, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you this morning. Nō reira, kia ora tātou katoa.